somewhere to run.
Pleasure meeting you too. The name's Rannick.
Demon Stone. This is one of those games that I saw all of one time in my entire life. I saw it in a bargain bin, and I remember looking at the cover and thinking, I really need to play this. The cover of it looked amazing, sort of like those promotional images for the old Final Fantasy games. It was like one color, and there's like an outline of like a hyper stylized character. It looked amazing, but the one time I saw it, I turned it down, and I kind of regretted it. But thanks to my girlfriend for sending me a copy, I now have a chance to, and it surprised me for a few reasons. First of all, upon booting it up, I learned this is a Dungeons & Dragons game. Now, me being the antisocial, anxiety-prone shut-in that I am, I don't actually know all that much about Dungeons & Dragons. I never had anyone to play with. It seems very interesting, but aside from the 2 arcade games that you can download now, which I have, I've had zero experience with this entire series. So to discover this was a Dungeons & Dragons game actually took me quite a bit by surprise. And it took me even more by surprise when I learned it was a beat-em-up of all things. Although, granted, so were the arcade games. Now, before we continue, I do have to apologize. I don't have a lot of footage to show you. I recorded literally a full playthrough of the game, and right when I finished, my computer decided it had no room left and corrupted everything I recorded. That's great. So we're using what I have for my initial records, and I apologize for not having too much more. But this is a pretty interesting game. Now the story follows 3 characters: a warrior, a rogue, and a mage. Immediately saying that, I'm immediately drawn to saying this is probably the prototype to Trine, and that's almost actually kind of accurate based on what little I've played of Trine. But each of these characters end up kind of funneled through circumstance into this mine, and through their own explorative abilities end up sort of freeing 2 godlike entities that were trapped there. And now they are on a quest to try and basically recapture the 2 deity-esque guys and try and set right the world that they have kind of inadvertently wronged. Now, what immediately strikes me as weird about this game is, for a game based in the Dungeons & Dragons mythos, again, based on what little I know of it, there's actually very little of an actual narrative to this game. And, you know, like I said, based on what I know of Dungeons & Dragons, that's a very narrative-focused experience. Whereas this one, not so much. I mean, let's just stop for a minute and take a look at our 3 characters. You have a warrior who was knocked out in a raid by trolls and wants revenge. You have a wizard who's trying to find his path through fate. And then you've got a thief who's trying to rebel against basically everything because she's a halfling and never felt accepted anywhere. Alright, well, those first 2 are a little generic, but that 3rd one has potential to develop and grow and become something much more interesting. And those short little blurbs I just told you about the characters? Yeah, over the course of the entire game, that's all you will ever know about them. There is no character arc, there is no growth, there's no development. And like I said, 2 of those characters are about as generic sounding as possible. And I think part of the reason why there doesn't really seem to be all that much of a narrative development or anything over the course of the game is that it's just trying to rely on the crutch that it is more or less a beat-em-up. And therefore it's a game where, you know, story's not all that important, but at the same time, it's a world that at least establishes the start of characters. And at least one of those characters was very interesting. It's a world that has interesting locations and actually has some pretty cool looking creatures when you get to see them. It's a world that you really want to explore and know more about and see our characters grow and become more powerful and become more well-rounded characters, and that's just not happening. The most you get is a couple of cutscenes in between combat set pieces that give like 2 sentences of backstory that I've already covered in my overall summary of the characters. That's it over the course of the entire game, and that is seriously lacking, especially considering it's in such an interesting setting. And unfortunately, the theme of missed opportunities doesn't really stop there. So let's move on to the gameplay. The gameplay itself is a fairly standard beat-em-up, aside from the fact that you kind of control a party of 3. Every character can sort of button mash beat 'em up their way through any enemy, and they do it about as equally well. However, each character sort of has a specialization. The mage, being a magic user, has the ability to basically cast unlimited ranged magic, which makes him the go-to ranged attacker guy, because both the rogue and the fighter have limited throwing knives or throwing axes, which means if you ever want to focus on anything long ranged, and there are certain set pieces that require you to do so, you basically want to focus entirely on the wizard. Alright, that's fine, that's fine. And the warrior, well, he does brawl basically about as well as any of the others. He does seem to do a little bit more damage from his physical attacks. You know, he's not terribly exciting conceptually, but that's at least something. What I have a problem with, however, is probably the one character I like the most, the rogue, because she seems, in terms of gameplay, to basically just be a third wheel. She doesn't do a lot of melee damage compared to the warrior, and she doesn't have any sort of range speciality. Instead, the only thing she has for any sort of combat speciality is she can run into glittery shadows, because, as we all know, shadows glitter. She can turn invisible, and if she can sneak up behind the enemy, she can instantly take it out, provided it's not a boss or like a superpowered enemy. Now that sounds all well and good on paper. However, only like 1 in every 7 or so fights actually feature these shadows, which means unlike the other characters which have a permanent use, the warrior being the meat shield and the mage constantly causing damage from afar, she has no combat niche. She is literally stuck there just kind of button mashing, hoping to at least do some damage before the warrior murders things. And that's a huge missed opportunity. See, if it were up to me, and we kept with the theme that for the most part your entire team is always stuck together as opposed to splitting them up to try and handle combat from different perspectives and vantage points, which would have been a way more interesting way to approach this, what I would have done is have her be sort of like a debuffer. Have her sneak around and set traps, or use the environment as some sort of extra damage, like super trap, so to speak. Sneaking around some ruins, pushing a giant rock over onto the enemies, killing them all at once. Or just laying traps everywhere to slow enemies down or to weaken them, make them easier prey for your other two characters, but at the cost of her relying on stealth and therefore being a little bit less of a meat shield. Unfortunately, she does seem to take a little bit more damage than the others from what I can tell, but she doesn't really have any sort of set speciality in combat, which makes her infinitely less useful than the other two, which is a shame because, like I said, she's kind of my favorite out of the three. Now, another thing worth noting is that this game does feature a lot of set pieces that are kind of supposed to highlight your character's speciality. Usually, your one character will be the only one usable, and they will take out a certain situation a certain way based on their own powers. For example, your rogue would sneak around in the shadows and one-hit kill guards to infiltrate a larger enemy complex without alerting anyone sooner. Or while riding down the river, you can use your mage to try and attack monsters on the other side that are hitting you with ranged attacks. Unfortunately, this also leads to another problem. In a specific moment that actually did require the mage to basically be the one controllable character, you have to try and stop this one character from creating a portal. And that's all well and good, except that your side of where you're attacking from is flooding with enemies. Now, this would mean, ideally, that the mage would attack the person casting the portal, while your other two meat shields take care of everyone attacking him. Well, this leads to one of the biggest problems combat-wise, which is your team AI is dumb as hell. I lost that encounter about 6 times because my teammates wouldn't actually actively attack the opponents and they would all just target me as the wizard. Now, I could have swapped to the other characters, but then the wizard wouldn't be attacking the person casting the portal, and then I'd lose the encounter because the whole goal was to stop that. Or this one time where I had to fight this giant goblin thing, and he was just trying to wail on me, and I was defending, so I couldn't actually take damage. That was great, but I wasn't getting any sort of opportunity to attack. And my teammates were literally standing right behind him, staring at him, picking their noses, watching the boss just keep trying to take me down when I couldn't take any damage. I mean, it was basically a stalemate just because my teammates were dumb. And because they all have individual health pools, you have to try and keep them alive as well. Now, the nice thing is they do actually end up going after health pickups every now and then, but at the same time, if you need one, well, suddenly that cuts down your resources as well, which isn't exactly ideal. Which is unfortunate because a lot of these set pieces are genuinely interesting, and the concept of controlling an entire party by yourself is an idea with merit. But the fact that it executes it by throwing all 3 characters into the same area at once, and then basically forces you to micromanage each and every one of them or you don't get anywhere, kind of ruins the entire experience. That said, I will say, those set pieces that aren't just simply brawling are pretty brilliant. I was trying to climb down this giant tower being besieged by monsters, and I just kept destroying monsters, but I wasn't getting anywhere. It wasn't until I realized that, oh, I actually have to destroy their point of ingress before everything stops and I can move on, that I could really do anything, and that really hit home, because there are a bunch of set pieces in this game that actually require you to think outside the box. It's not just a simple beat 'em up, like this game likes to kind of appear, and combat-wise it totally is. The set pieces themselves actually require a little bit of out-of-the-box thinking, which is brilliant. However, it does run into one other problem. See, very shortly into the game, your characters each get a different artifact that gives them a special ability. The warrior gets a gauntlet that lets him smash the ground because reasons. The mage gets beads that are basically bombs. And once again, our girl, the rogue, she gets jumping because they decided to make platforming a thing in this game. And platforming in beat-em-ups has never really worked. Moreover, in 3D environments with beat-em-ups, oh yeah, and did I mention this game likes a director's choice camera? Combine all of those three things and you've got a lot of really bad things happening at once. Now the nice thing is, for the most part, platforming was relegated to one or two hidden things I found, as opposed to something that was just shoved onto you for the main adventure. But it still came up every now and then. And I'm not gonna lie, the platforming isn't great. It sometimes ends up feeling like the platforms don't really understand if you actually landed on top of them or you didn't. And in one time, I actually landed on the corner of one, and the game thought I was falling, but also standing on the platform. So I was actually stuck permanently falling next to this platform. And I actually had to restart that entire level, which was not great. Like I said, this game also has a director's choice camera, which is incredibly disorienting when it decides to swap around, and combine that with platforming, it's terrible. However, there are some really neat mechanics here, such as at the end of every level you can visit a shop to upgrade your items, and these items can change the elemental affinity of your weapons, buff your weapons, give you better armor, give you permanent buffs such as permanent minor health increase and health recovery, as well as leveling up your characters, giving them different combo potentials, giving them greater abilities. And that is really cool, especially when you actually look at your character's armor when you buy new armor, or when you look at their abilities and they seem visibly different. Now that said, you could just button mash the X button to finish basically every level, outside of those preset set pieces that require you to play as a different character. Or you could just stick as the mage and just magic everything to death, because it kind of stops everything in its tracks. At least they tried, and some of the gameplay is a lot of fun. It does feel like there's a lot of really cool ideas going on here. They're just not super well thought out. It's like they need to take a step back and just analyze how everything kind of works, because it feels like everything has a good idea, but is underdeveloped. As well, if you're the kind of person who doesn't enjoy a short game, you might want to skip this. This game has about 10 levels, each level maybe being 20 minutes long, if that, so you can beat the game pretty quickly. Like I said, I pretty much finished this game in one sitting. But that said, it was a fun brawling experience all the same, in spite of its issues and lack of polish. The overall presentation to Demon's Stone is really nice. Like I said, I really like the world it tries to set up. I think the individual monsters and their designs are really cool. They might actually be rooted in old school D&D, I'm not sure. Like I said, I never played, but I do like the world it sets up. I like that every area has different little bits of environment that you can interact with. I love that every area seems to have different unique monsters to fight. That's really cool. In general, I just love the different areas and the characters that are developed within them. And again, the set pieces they make, they're just kind of breathtaking when you see them. They're really cool. This game looks great. Audio-wise, it's pretty excellent. I don't remember a lot of the actual soundtrack, but I remember the theme of the opening level, and I immediately just said, wow, this game sounds great. Also, not only is the voice acting pretty damn snazzy, they got Patrick Stewart in here. I don't think I can complain about the voice acting at all. The overall presentation for Demon's Stone, it looks a little dated now, but it's still pretty impressive for what it is, I think. Could use maybe a little bit more color here and there to make some stuff stand out, but overall, high quality. Now, if you want a copy of Demon's Stone on the PS2, it was also apparently on the original Xbox, which means it probably would have looked maybe a little bit better on there, run maybe a little bit better as well. Cheapest one I'm seeing right now, $5. That's pretty good, honestly. I have to give a huge shout out and thank you to my girlfriend for sending this to the show. I always wanted to know what the game behind that amazing cover was, and honestly, the cover is the best part of this game. The story is kind of lacking, and it feels like the overall combat mechanics and world progression are not as well thought out as they could be, but it's still an interesting experience, and I think that the world this game sets up is pretty fun. I like this game, and for a 3D beat 'em up, that actually says quite a lot. It has its issues. Hell, it has a lot of issues, but for a game as inexpensive as $5, I think it's pretty decent and might be worth checking into if you're a fan of D&D, or you're interested in beat-em-ups, especially 3D beat-em-ups, because there really aren't too many of those until they kind of evolved into Rising Zan and all of Rising Zan's clones anyway. Or maybe if you just really like that cover art like I do, because it's damn good cover art. Overall, I'm glad I finally got to experience that mysterious game I saw in that bargain bin so long ago, because it looked fascinating, and it is. Maybe not for the story, and maybe not for excellent gameplay or anything, but overall it's a fun experience, and for an inexpensive pickup, or for D&D fans, I think it's a decent enough play. Overall, Demon's Stone, it's recommended. It was an interesting second foray into the D&D world. I think I still prefer the old arcade games, but to get to experience this world a little bit more, that was more than worth it.
Smoke!